You there? Good evening. This is the Friends of History Debating Society, a little late, seating ourselves in a very cold night in Londinium, 92 AD. The centurions, the tough guys, they can sit there and smile at us. Well, we're just Equus class guys. We don't work. We didn't live the life of vigor that you men did. And on cold nights like this, we're late to the dance. But I welcome Germanicus, my colleague, because always it is helpful to take what I read during the week, way too much, and I've been reading the 21st century again, very confusing, and then submit it to Germanicus, who has a commonsensical approach to these matters, such as the Russia-NATO conflict in the 21st century. I've got a whopper for us this week, Germanicus. It's overwhelming what I've discovered. There's a new book from a young professor at Columbia University, historian, Paul Thomas Chamberlain, Scorched Earth. It's 800 pages long, 20 chapters. I'm on chapter 5, and I'm gobsmacked. Because the day before I started this book, I had the great pleasure of talking to Sir Max Hastings, the British historian of the Second World War. And we spent 2 hours talking about Sword Beach. It was great fun. The landings, the Lord Lovett, the commandos and the Royal Marine contest, the Orne Bridge, all that romance of Sword Beach, and how the 21st Panzer Division is in place to counterattack, but the orders don't come till 4 in the afternoon. If they'd moved in the morning, they would have avoided the typhoon raids that destroyed their columns. You understand all of that. Well, I did that. That's romance, right? That's coming to the rescue.
It's been made into romance, yes.
Okay. So Sword Beach, just Sword Beach, and not Juneau's next. I'm gonna look for that. But in any event, the next day, I start a theory, a hypothesis, that all of that was the Europeans fighting the Europeans. It was a civil war within a tribe that moves collectively in one direction, which is to colonize and make subservient the rest of the planet. Race theory, that the colonization impulse of the 19th century, the contest of Britain and France and Italy and Germany, and Spain, of course, was colonizing since the 17th century. But the colony, America's colony, Australia, all of that was race. And it was the Caucasian white Christian race hiring, in a fashion of indentured servitude or slavery, the non-Christian, non-white race. And that the contest that I've always presented as ideological, which is the Soviet Leninist Marxist presentation of economies,
right,
versus the capitalist exploitation master and servant of Britain and America, was just a lot of foolishness. Or it might have had a bite at one time, say the Revolution of 1848, but not since then. And religion, which is how we divided ourselves up, at least since, I don't know, the 4th century when Rome pulled back. I don't know how long the religion wars went on. Certainly the Christians fought Christians. That's what the Nicene Creed is about.
Well, Christianity created religious wars in Europe.
Yeah.
That's what it did.
Okay, so the idea that the religious wars replaced by the nationalist wars, the empires, replaced by the race theory, and we're stuck in race wars, is the theory of the book. And that Sword Beach and the brave landing on Normandy and the march across France was the Europeans fighting Europeans with no one coming forward to saying, what are we doing here? We're fighting for freedom. What freedom are we giving the rest of the planet? Is the theory. And I wrote you that quote from Averell Harriman. We'll get to that eventually. It is shocking to read eugenics. It is shocking to read race theory in the 1920s. It is shocking to read what was tolerated, what seems so unbelievable in the 21st century to those who are not accustomed to reading that our forefathers, well, just one generation, our fathers and grandfathers lived in a world in which the assumption was that all was well because the Christian white nations were going to modernize the rest of the planet. That's how they lived. And it's a theory, and I submit it to you.
Our own time and our own people, we, the Romani, do not have a vision of race and racial superiority. I mean, for Jupiter's sake, there was an emperor whose name was Philip the Arab, for example. And there were people of all hues all through the Roman Empire. And of course, there were more slaves who happened to be what we would call people of color, but there was no distinguishing merit by race. And this is really a development. You could put it to the Crusades in a sense, but even so, even in spite of the interactions with the Muslim world, Christianity, that is to say, the Latin West, what we call Roman Catholic, was much less racially divided than the world that emerged during and after the Reformation. In other words, Calvinism and the other forms of the Protestant heresies essentially created what we think of as race in the period after the 1550s, but definitely the Calvinist interaction with the New World, the Dutch and the English, was stamped by, I would just hazard a guess, by the doctrine of predestination, and that opened the door for certain people to be selected to be superior to others. And of course, that's also in many ways because of the predominance of the English engagement in North America. The English brought all of their notions of race that had been emerging in the last not thousand years, but the last 500 or 600 years since the Battle of Hastings, and in which you had the creation of a racial hierarchy in the British Isles, with the Normans on the top, then the Anglo-Saxon, what remained of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, followed by Scottish lairds, then by Welshmen, and finally by the Irish, who were at the bottom. And this kind of racism according to nation, you can read about it or listen to it in the wonderful back and forth in Shakespeare's Henry V between Llewellyn, the Welshman, Nym, Bardolph, Pistol. They're all talking about race or nation, which are interchangeable terms in that period. And race really does take off in the 17th century, and you begin to get a kind of kick in the pants because of the entrepreneurial opportunities that West African slavery offered the Dutch and the English. And this became the main feature or the main dynamic, the main power force that drove the creation of an increasingly formalized hierarchy of race. And if you were to contrast North America with the Spanish, Latin America, Portuguese, Brazil, you had concepts of race, but they were moderated by the fact that um, everyone was considered a child of God, and the whole missionary effort that the Spanish especially had made created a more fluid dynamics. And actually, the dominant form of distinguishing was between Spanish, born in Spain and living in Spain, or having recently emigrated, and the Spanish, the descendants of the Spanish conquistadores who occupied a lower social strata, and it was always very confusing too, because in spite of the fact that people don't know this, they were still the leftover aristocracy of the pre-Columbian um, empires, like not the Toltecs, for example, and others. And that aristocracy was still honored by Spain and then Mexico to increasingly lesser and lesser extent. But in spite of all the differentiations, there's um, a fundamental divide between Protestant Calvinist notions of race, which are Northern European, and the notion, the way in which race was handled in Latin America. And on that score, you had incredibly complex hierarchy of race within Europe, obviously with England at the top, and then you go on down the line. Uh, and eventually you'd get to the lowest races that were still white, which would be, you know,
Irish,
Sicilians and Greek.
and the Irish.
Yeah,
Right?
Albanians and the Irish. The Irish in the 19th century in cartoons were portrayed as though they were apes.
Beasts of the field who only need to
Right.
eat once a day. Yes, that was the famine of 47.
Right.
Right there, we didn't need to overfeed them, and they're lazy, so we've got to make them work harder in the workhouses than they do outside. Yeah, it it's astonishing. All of it. I don't know why I can't tell you why I've skipped it, because I thought it was going in the wrong direction. In other words, it was an excuse for war. His theory,
Yeah, his theory.
which is based on a lot of quotes, is that it was the war. Here's for the academics listening to us, the Journal of Race Development, okay? Founded in 1910. The first American academic journal of international relations, founded by G. Stanley Hall with George Hubbard Blakesley of Clark University. It changed its name later to the Journal of International Relations. Then it became, in 1922, Foreign Affairs. That is the distinguished journal now. I have my copies stacked up over there for international relations commentary. The big theory. I believe the Telegram was foreign relations. So what we're looking at here is academia blessed race development. That was their euphemism.
And this was legitimate, not just in the foreign policy world, such as it was. It was a very small elite club, mostly Ivy League. But teaching at Harvard was one of the more famous popular writers of the 1920s and 30s. His name was Lothrop Stoddard, and his big bestseller was entitled The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. published in 1920. And it was such a bestseller that there's an entire paragraph devoted to making fun of it in F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby. So obviously, it was the talk of the town in the 1920s. And he was lecturing at the Naval War College when I was doing my dissertation research for my first book. I went through his lectures and the papers that students who had names like Halsey and Nimitz were writing about the problem of race. And it was exceedingly strange because it is absolutely inverted today, completely flipped. And I think that we can discern a reason for why that's happened as well.
What religion and nationalism had begun to for earlier eras, race, the journal warned race might be to the 20th century.
Yeah.
Alongside tensions between European and non-Western people. Buell warned of racial disputes between white nationalities. Normandy becomes a dispute between white nationalities.
Yes.
Not saving the world for democracy.
Oh, yeah, that Normandy, not the Normandy of Joan of Arc.
Yes.
Well, here's the reason I brought up the complex hierarchy of European races that so beset thinking in the Victorian period. And that is that Russia occupied this murky place.
Yes.
France was seen as lesser. Even Germany was seen as slightly lesser by the English. But the English especially disliked Russia. Not only was Russia potentially a threat, and of course the British essentially fought a Cold War from the 1830s all the way until practically World War I.
And they might have assassinated a Tsar. Might have.
And they fought a hot war, the Crimean War, and they were about to go to war with Russia in 1878. And here's the problem. Russia was Orthodox. And it's important to note that race is a stalking horse for identity in the sense that it's used as a benchmark, a kind of scientific benchmark for superiority. And ever since the Great Schism and then the sack of Constantinople by Catholic crusaders sanctioned by the Pope, Innocent III, that the Orthodox Church has been seen as schismatic and possibly even heretical. And so Russia occupied this lower rung among white Europeans. And then the fact that Russia began to encompass all of these Central Asian lands and Far Eastern lands, but which weren't colonies, which were part of Russia, only made it worse. And the Soviet Union was the final nail in the coffin as far as Brits were concerned, because suddenly, according to the Soviet Constitution, the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks and the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks all were equal to Russians. And of course, there was this constant hum beginning in Victorian times that Russia had been Mongolized and degraded by being ruled by Mongols and then Tatars in the Khanate of Crimea. And thus an Asian element admixture had diluted whatever, original Scandinavian, Swedish roots Russia had. And this has been a continuous line of thinking and representation in fiction as well as academic histories that basically push the inferiority, the primitiveness of Russia. So
the Mongolized. One more detail about it, because I'm only read a quarter of the book, but it's 800 pages. It takes me a while. The Japanese and the Chinese. The Japanese believe they are the superior race of East Asia. and that the Filipinos and the Indonesians, and especially the Chinese, know it and must be contained.
Yeah, Japan has always had an inferiority complex regarding China, the mother civilization, which is manifested by their uh, putting China beneath them. China's dirty. It's not well cultivated. It isn't pure and high minded. It doesn't have the warrior sort of purity that Japan does. And I have to say that Japan's belief in itself and its ferocious identity had a very powerful impact on Europeans, and especially, as you might imagine, on Brits. And the Brits really respected the Japanese, so did the Americans. And Perry's visit, or two visits to Japan in the 1850s, helped to cement this respect for Japan. And so Japan was always treated better in all of the immigration contretemps of the late 19th and early 20th century, and is still treated better today because of the capacity of the Japanese to insinuate themselves emotionally into American civilization. The Chinese did it, but they did it through food. And secondarily, the old cliche about laundry. So they immediately were in a lesser position, just as Greeks were, because Greeks were also restaurateurs, but that immediately placed them in a service ranking in the hierarchy of status. And the Japanese were always one step above that.
I'm speaking with Germanicus about a new book, Scorched Earth, A Global History of World War II by the young historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain. And we're going to turn to America's struggle with race right now, called migration. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium, Chile, February in Londinium, 92 AD. We'll be back. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. The Centurions, my gosh, they weathered all kinds of extremes in their 25 years in service. And they sit there with their arms crossed, smiling at me, knowing that I'm shivering. Gentlemen, it's cold outside. All right, fine, I understand. You're a bunch of tough guys. We're going to America's struggles right now with migration. It seemed so obvious to me when I was reporting on the Darien Gap and the rushing of the border. And it seemed so obvious to me in the campaign of 24, when the Republicans were emphasizing that the Biden administration made this decision to open the border to all comers. And there were some protocols that were acknowledged. You have to fill out a form saying you're seeking sanctuary, and we'll call you in X number of months, or it can be a long time before your hearing. All of that interpreted in terms of the remarks by Paul Thomas Chamberlain, having not finished the book, but just the part where he addresses the contest in Northern Europe starting in 1939, 1938, and where I am right now is the overrunning of Denmark and the fall of France. More battles to come. That was a war between the white Christians, a fight for superiority of Northern Europe. What they had in common was much more than they had separately. Not Marxism, not fascism, not capitalism. What they had in common was they were all colonial masters and had been for hundreds of years. And that the Americans absorbed from the British the masterful empire of the earth. We could project power anywhere against the non-white races. Now, migration. Again, it's fresh to me, so I'm struggling here, Germanicus. The migration of 2021, 22, 23 that we saw at the border, that was race. But I'm not sure how to interpret it. If that border had been rushed by Northern Europeans, well, we'd wonder why, because you can come visit anytime. We're Europeans. When it comes in terms of race conflict, we're Europeans. We can't say you're depending on America for defending you from the, despots of the Oriental despots. We're the same as they are. Our founding fathers, George Washington, was not only a slave master, what he wrote of the Native Americans was appalling. And he was consistent with American leadership ever since. They don't talk about it, but there it is. And when we see the Trump administration castigated for the brutality towards migrants, aren't we looking at the vouchsafing of the abuse of those who ran the colonies, for the sugar colonies in the Caribbean, for example, or the colonies in Egypt, run by the British? Is that what Trump is doing? And is that the tension? Because there are always going to be Europeans who object.
It's a difficult dynamic to face, because what is actually going on, I believe, is completely disconnected from all the rhetoric that has been manufactured and is like a smokescreen surrounding what's really going on. And the dynamic is really a political dynamic in which elites were of two minds about the immigrants they were importing. On one hand, they loved the cheap labor, and on the other hand, they were afraid of insurrection or political upheaval, and this was manifest early on with the Irish flood that began with the famine, of course, and continued with Italians and even Norwegians and Swedes in the latter part of the 19th century, and was certainly there with African American slaves. And it's fascinating because there is this desire. Again, this is mostly an elite thing, a desire to control and at the same time take advantage of. And it's not a pretty picture. And we have to remember that even though chattel slavery in the South is something we think of as a characteristically evil Southern institution, in fact, slavery was very widespread in the North as well before the American Revolution and even after. And then there was this sort of parallel institution called indentured servitude, in which parents would sell their children for some period of time to be a slave. Usually it benefited them because they became apprentices to wealthy small businessmen and the like. But the fact is that some form of slavery and servitude is a major part of American life until very recently. And of course, we all remember the child labor and the sweatshops of the Industrial Revolution, almost all of them in the North, where conditions were not only more appalling than they were in the agrarian South, for those enfeoffed, as it were, but they had no more agency often than their counterpart chattel laborers in the South. It's a very muddy situation, and today, of course, it's still political because the main benefit of having large numbers of people come in from other places is that not only can they be paid less, like the H-1B visa types, and thus naturally displace Americans who were born here, but also they are likely to vote for those who are helping them come and then continuing to take care of them. And so I think it was an explicit element of blue thinking that bring in enough migrants quickly enough and you will change the character of the electorate in favor of blue. And of course, as we saw in the last election, immigrants who have been here for some period of time tend to get more conservative, and they were frankly shocked by the conservative attitudes, especially of Hispanics, but also among blacks as well. So there is this continuing thread of immigrants as property of the elites in one way or another, and that has been a leitmotif. I mean, it's run like a electric thread through American life and American history.
I see something that connects to a remark you made earlier about our Rome, where we conquering the Mediterranean basin with the probe into Londinium, where we are, and Libya, and that was their word for our Roman word for Africa, and constantly slamming our heads against the Persians, what will become the Persians in the East. We were an empire of many races, exotic, certainly. And America, in becoming the new Rome, its strength is oft times you can argue with those many races. My mother's family, I have a photograph of them on the ferry outside of the Bronx. Mother must be 3 years old, and her mother standing above her and her sister next to her. Very dark, very dark. Persian dark. That, you know the tone, Michael.
I sure do. My friends.
Right.
They have it.
I'm one generation. One.
Right.
And I'd have to forget who I am to make a statement that is as uninformed as some of those statements I'm hearing from those who are justifying the uniform deportation of the non-white, non-Christians, said to be criminals.
Well, there are a couple of things to say about that, drawing on our experience as Romani. And the first is that Rome was strengthened by having all of these different quote-unquote races. And Rome had a mechanism for their upward mobility. And we're sitting here with them, our centurions, who've become Roman, and many of them are from Hispania, or they're from Germania, or they're from Numidia, and yet they have become Roman. And this is something that's very special, and it's very successful. When Caesar conquered Gaul, I mean, he may have killed 20% of the Gaulois in Gallia, but the rest of them have become more Roman than the Romans and produce better wine than that in Italia. So it's a testament to Rome. But the dark part of this, which is not so necessarily dissimilar in the United States, is that it was upward mobility and assimilation and rewards to become Roman that only extended so far. And the inexorable pathway that we see in Rome's imperial course is that the rich get richer, and that attains until the Western Empire comes apart. And speaking of the Western Empire coming apart, that was a problem of migration too. Migration in you might call too large, too fast, and the peoples who were brought in, beginning with the Visigoths, and then the Ostrogoths, and of course a bunch of others, the Alans and other Germanic tribes, the Vandals, broke in, like coming from Darien, but instead crossing the frozen Rhine. They all came in as national groups. And part of the problem with the elite policy today is that it wants to keep them as groups because the thinking goes that will keep them voting blue, but it's a real mistake, because this is what broke apart the Western Empire, was the fact that the new participants were not becoming good Romans. I mean, they became Christianized eventually and learned Latin, but they started their own little kingdoms. And this is an issue that I think is worrisome. And if you look at the scores of immigration bills throughout American history, and it's amazing. You can go to an immigration timeline on the internet, and you can see that there are treaties and executive orders and acts of Congress every 3 years, starting around 1870. And it's amazing what a headache and what a neuralgic and obsessive issue immigration has been for most of American history. What we're seeing today is not new. And many of these acts, whether they were exclusion acts or they were rough, and they gave the U.S. government the right to do all sorts of things with immigrants or to immigrants. You know, one act actually said that if an American citizen, a woman, married a foreigner who was not an American citizen, she would be stripped of her citizenship. So, I mean, what was done with Mexicans and American Indians, not just African Americans, is amazing to behold. And you just go through this timeline, and every 3 years there's some contretemps, some big upheaval.
Germanicus is Marco Vlahos. I am Gaius. We're in Londinium. It is 92 AD and very chilly. There will be no theater. It won't be till springtime now. It's just not safe to sit in the seats with ice next to you. It's not wise. So we'll sacrifice to Augustus. But the question I have for Germanicus when we come back, it can't be answered, but it's fun to ask it. What did we fight the Second War for? What did we fight the First War for? What was the reason? What was driving it? I mean, 1914 to 1918, 1939 to 1945. Why? When we come back, I'm John Batchelor. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in a chilly, chilly, chilly February day in Londinium. We have our second cup of wine. Maybe a third, as gentlemen, is necessary tonight. The wine's on us, you know that. Pour away. And we're very chilly, but at the same time, I, Gaius, in my random reading, have come across a theory that it doesn't explain too much, but it explains things that I've looked past. And I come to the end of the war. It is July 1945. The Germans have surrendered. The Japanese are fighting on. They don't know about the bomb. The bomb test Trinity is the middle of July. So this exchange between Averell Harriman, the ambassador to the Soviet Union from the United States, and the inheritor of the Harriman fortune, railroaders. They built the railroad with non-Christians out west. Harriman is talking to Joseph Stalin in Berlin. There's not a building standing in Berlin. It's just bricks. That's what they're standing in. U.S. Ambassador to the Soviet Union, Averell Harriman, greeted Joseph Stalin in the devastated city of Berlin, writes Professor Chamberlain. Harriman remarked that the Soviet leader must be pleased to finally enter the capital after 4 years of brutal warfare. Stalin paused. So Alexander got to Paris, he grumbled. Indeed, he did. Alexander I made it to Paris. Correct. The triumphant dictator's chilling response fed Harriman's deep suspicions. Vast stretches of Europe had been reduced to smoking piles of rubble. You bet. Rubble. We didn't stop until the cities were rubble. Countless bodies lay buried in the ruins while the Allies met in Potsdam to determine the shape of the post-war world. We're living in it. All of the contradictions of Potsdam deepen the contradictions of Versailles. This is the agreement between the white Christian nations and, here comes the kicker. For Harriman, the stakes could not have been greater. Moscow had unleashed, quote, a 20th century barbarian invasion of Europe. That's what Harriman had written months earlier. Unless American leaders could meet the Soviet threat, Harriman writes, history would record this period as the next next generation as the Soviet age. Here's the twist. Now, gazing across the ruins of the Third Reich, Averell Harriman's mood turned back towards the apocalyptic. He writes, the greatest crime of Hitler was that his actions had resulted in opening the gates of Eastern Europe to Asia. It's astonishing to me, Germanicus. Standing in the ruin of Berlin, Harriman was threatened by Stalin's despotism. Stalin wasn't one of them. Is that an explanation that makes sense for the deep-seated, almost genetic despising of the Russians?
You could call it genetic for all the fact that it is so deeply attached to the skeleton of Western European civilization. Goes back 1,500 years to Byzantium. But the fact is that, yes, it was this notion of Oriental despotism, this fear of the Red Hordes, which would soon be joined at the hip to the Yellow Hordes. And so when China went communist, this was the big thunderclap. It was as though, and then of course you have the Bandung Conference, and you get Sukarno and Nehru pulling together this threat to Europe, and it is very, very racialist, and it's led to a kind of inversion in Europe itself, in which Europe has now receiving its former slaves, as it were, its former coloniae into its arms, and yet they are coming with a kind of vengeance. I mean, this can be seen whether they're Muslim or whether they are African, and it is a big deal in Europe today. It is the center of the upheaval, and it is what happens when empire is turned around, or turned inside out, rather. And so you have a sort of unconscious atonement by elites who seek to it's more than reparations. It's a kind of self-sacrifice, that our civilization was so terrible in creating imperialism that we need to let them in. But it's still racist. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the racialism as an ideology is so intense that the new participants, the new immigrants to Europe, have imbibed a kind of colonizer spirit. And you hear this voiced by imams all the time, and others who say, we're here to turn Britain Muslim.
Right, right.
That's our mission. And so, if you will, it's the colonial mentality once manifested by Europeans being turned around on them, and they're willing, sacrificial lambs, as it were.
When the Trump administration invents something called the Golden Dome, which is Germanicus, okay? I'm not going to characterize it. Just when he invents it. And when they talk about stretching the security from the Arctic, from the Northwest Passage now opening to Patagonia, and protecting the Panama Canal, protecting Greenland, protecting the approaches to Alaska. Is that the voice of a colonizer?
It's different when it comes to America, because after all, America is exceptional, right? We don't have colonies.
Except we do.
We don't call them that,
Canada, Venezuela, Panama, we do.
Right. And we've had that internally. I mean, when Andrew Jackson got Congress to agree to do an ethnic cleansing of the Southeast and move all of the
Trail of Tears.
Yeah. And that's been the entire story of the U.S.
And we present it as ideology.
Now it is, and yet the ideology is the smokescreen, because underneath it all, the elites, who, like the Romans in the later empire, just keep getting richer and richer. They feel that they're all protected from this. They don't mind if America becomes a third world country in which the vast majority of people are peons and working, in the gig economy, and while they keep getting richer, and they're protected. And that is the sensibility of the place I live, and I have a feeling the place you live.
I'll read more for next week, I promise. And then I'll get back to, I've got a great new story, the story of Andersonville.
Oh.
In detail. I mean, why did I not see that I didn't have that before? It was always referred to, but not actually explored.
Yeah, that was it's tough. It's tough when you're the losing side and you can't feed yourself. Guess what happens to all of the prisoners you have? Yeah.
And then I have a new biography. Well, it's not a biography. It's a drama about the killing of Trotsky. Doesn't that sound fabulous?
Yeah.
The pursuit and the approach and the sophisticated techniques used to get close to him?
Well, I mean, it was an impossible task for him. He could never have anything like reasonable security in Mexico City.
Bouncing around the Friends of History Debating Society. You bet we are. There's this applying of race theory. Is it that those who speak of justice, are they aware of the double talk?
No, they're not. They can't be. It's self-awareness, and self-awareness is in short supply in any society in any time in history. And not that there aren't individuals who see it all, but they're just ignored. They are saying the wrong thing. And so I think it's below the ability of the society, especially elites, because elites operate out of fear of being overthrown. And so they can't afford to show any cracks, and they deeply and viciously enforce the rules.
I'm going to see on eBay if I can get a copy of the 1910 Journal of Race Development. Wow. I mean, just wow.
That would be worth it.
Yes, I will seek. eBay, if you're listening, I'm coming looking for it.
Yeah, I have Stoddard's books. They're amazing to read.
That wasn't long enough ago to make it go away.
Well, it hasn't changed. It's just inverted.
We will, of course, sacrifice to Augustus, our founding emperor, and then trundle on home wrapped in as many sheepskins as we can find. The centurions, we toast you, gentlemen. You held the empire together, and we're going to have a good run, about another 1,000 years. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius John Batchelor. This is Londinium. Thank you for attending. Good night.